Hello, and welcome to Astronomy 100. In this particular segment, we're going to start one of the longest sections of the semester, and it's also one of the most important sections of the Astronomy 100 semester. The reason for this is that we're going to begin the section titled Remote Measurements. And in this section, we're going to describe how it is that astronomers are able to make their measurements and learn about objects that are remote, objects that are too far away for us to be able to do traditional measurements. An example is, in other sciences, we have in chemistry the ability to mix chemicals and to have the ability to conduct an experiment that you control in a laboratory. In physics, there are experiments that can be conducted in a laboratory setting to help understand the workings of the universe related to physics. In biology, if you're interested in understanding how the internal working of an animal might be, you might be able to cut it open, and in an autopsy format, you could see the internal workings of any living creature. But in astronomy, we don't have those luxuries. In astronomy, we are often studying objects that are very, very far away. These are objects that are so far away that in reality, humans will just never be able to travel these immense distances. In addition to that, the objects that we study are in places that are very dangerous to humans. It is a place where the energy coming from these objects or the energy of the environment is something that is just deadly to humans. So astronomers, although astronomy is a very old science, astronomers have always had a bit of a disadvantage when it comes to learning about the universe because of the remoteness of the universe. We're stuck here on the Earth trying to learn about a universe that is too far away and essentially inaccessible. So how do we get around these problems? How are we still able to learn about the objects of the universe in a remote fashion? Well, let's talk about the big picture of how this works. And the way that we're going to do this is describe the nature of light. And the reason why is because our ability to learn about the universe remotely all hinges on the ability to study objects that we cannot touch. And so astronomy as a science is not an experimental science, it's an observational science. We use various instruments to study the universe in an observational fashion. We don't have the ability to conduct experiments to be able to learn about the universe that we're trying to understand. But what helps us is in our universe, all things in our universe, all natural objects will radiate energy in the form of light. And this light is something that comes from everything in the universe, including you. Although you can't actually see the light that is coming from a human being, there is light that comes from anything, including humans. And we'll talk about how we know that and how we can measure that. So in essence, what helps us is because in our universe, all things create light or radiate light, that light can travel immense distances. There's no limit to how far light can travel. So here on Earth, we're stuck studying a universe that's very far from us and inaccessible. But the objects that we are interested in studying are producing light that will travel any distance to reach us. So we can see these very far away objects, and we can actually see these very distant places, and we can measure the light that comes from these places. And one of the single most important ideas in this entire section that we're going to continuously come back to is the idea that light is the carrier of information. The light that comes from objects will carry information about the objects that we are interested in. And so the idea is, if we can understand the nature of light itself, what is light, how does it travel, what information can light carry, then we can understand the nature of the objects that are emitting the light. So in this section, what we're going to do is spend quite a bit of time understanding what light is, how it travels, and how it's able to carry the important information about these objects that we want to learn about. So the title of this section, Remote Measurements, is an appropriate and important one because we are forever making measurements of objects that are quite remote. The two goals that we're going to work our way through over the next few segments are related to how light can carry information. So here's the first goal. In the universe around us, one of the most important things to learn about an object would be the temperature of the object. Eventually, we'll learn what temperature is and what information temperature tells us about objects. But as you can imagine, one of the problems with determining the temperature of something is the fact that we traditionally have to physically touch or come into contact with what it is we're trying to measure the temperature of. An example might be when you're a young child, and if you're not feeling well, your mother might come up and put her hand on your forehead to try to see if you're running a fever. And the idea is that by physically touching you, she can feel through contact with your skin what your temperature is, if you're hot or if you're cool to the touch. Now imagine trying to measure the temperature of something without the ability to touch. Every young child is taught when you touch something that's very hot, you learn very quickly that that was bad, but you had to actually physically touch something hot to know what hot means. So in astronomy, we have this problem of not being able to physically come into contact with the objects that we want to know the temperature of. So that's a challenge. How do we know how hot the sun is if we've never had a thermometer put into the sun, or if we've never come into contact with the sun? How do we know what the temperature of the clouds of Jupiter is if we don't have the ability to physically touch those clouds? So our first goal that we're going to work our way through is discovering ways that we can determine the temperature of an object without having the ability to touch. The second goal that we're going to work our way through is also very critical, and that is, how do we determine the composition of something that we don't have the ability to touch? So an example would be when you want to know the ingredients of something that you're eating, whether it's a cookie or maybe the spaghetti sauce that you're preparing on your stove. Normally, to figure out how the flavor is changing as you're preparing it, you are constantly tasting it. So can you imagine what it would be like to try to figure out what something's composition is, how much salt it has, how many flavorings or seasoning it has, without ever being able to sample the thing that you're trying to figure out? And in astronomy, that's the problem that we have. If we want to know the temperature of the sun, we'll find a way to do that. But we also want to know, what is the sun made out of? What are the ingredients of the sun? And you would think to be able to do that would require us to go to the sun, gather up some of its material, and bring it back and figure out what its composition is. But we don't have that luxury. And so unfortunately, we have to figure out a way to determine the composition of something without having a sample. Now, what these two goals have in common is that what answers the challenge of these two goals is light. Light is the carrier of information. And so what we will find is that the light coming from an object will tell us the temperature of the object. And the light that is coming from an object will tell us what it is made out of. So light is the carrier of information, is the main theme of how we are able to figure out the nature of objects that are just too far away for us to be able to physically come into contact. So let's start with the first couple of ideas that go along with this. The two pictures that you see on the screen here have something in common. And if you look at the picture on the left, it's a very obvious picture of the sun off in the distance, a body of water underneath it here, and some grass in the foreground. And you are frequently noticing the sun in the sky, and we often take it for granted. But the sun has an enormous amount of information that it's in essence trying to tell us. There is information about the nature of the sun as an object that is coming from the sun. And it's the light that the sun produces that has that information coded or contained within it. And if we had the ability to figure out how to determine what light can tell us, we would have the ability to determine what the nature of the sun is. So an example is on the right here. This photograph is just a standard picture of a rainbow. And although when we look at rainbows, we notice how pretty they are, the colors, the backdrop of a snow-peaked mountain in the background, but the actual rainbow itself is telling us an enormous amount of information. The colors of the rainbow are not just pretty colors. The information of the colors you see here is actually telling us something about the sun. So the fact that we see these colors, and the fact that we see the brightnesses of each of these colors, and the fact that the colors are in a particular sequence is actually telling us something about the sun itself. So a rainbow is water droplets that takes sunlight and opens it up in a way to allow us to see the sunlight in a fashion we don't normally get to see with our eyes. So if we had the ability to expand or open up the light from the sun, we would quickly discover that there is information contained within that light. And later on, as we work our way through this topic, we will see how very critical a rainbow is when it comes to learning about the object that we would like to study. So we'll come back to that as we work our way through this section. What we're going to do is we're going to break it down into essentially three ways of attacking this topic and understanding of how we can figure out objects remotely. So on the screen I have a couple of items for you. Here's the first thing that we're going to do. We're going to talk about how light travels. We know that light travels from one place to another, and so what we're going to do is describe how light goes from one place to another and in what manner does it travel. Then what we'll do is we'll talk about what actually is light. It's a complicated answer to this thing that we take for granted, this thing that seems to be a big part of our everyday existence. So we'll talk about what is the actual light itself, what is the physics of the light that we are seeing. But then ultimately, we're going to bring these two into the third topic of what information can we actually learn from the light. What information is coded onto the light that will allow us to learn something about the objects that we're interested in. So let me start with two examples. On the screen here, I have a couple of different standard light bulbs. These would be light bulbs that you could purchase if you were to go to a hardware store today to buy a replacement bulb. You can still purchase what are called incandescent bulbs that look like this, the glass housing with a bright filament on the bulb, or becoming more and more common are these compact fluorescent bulbs. And both of these could produce light to put into a lamp, to produce light for your living room. But the reason why I show you these two examples is because our first example here on the left, an incandescent light bulb, is an instrument that produces light by making something very, very hot. So this piece of metal called the filament that's stretched across these two posts is made out of a metal that can withstand very, very high temperatures. And when the tungsten metal that is part of this filament becomes very hot, the light bulb will produce light. So in nature, we can have light produced by something that is very hot. And what you can start to see are the clues that will tell us how we can determine the temperature of something by the light that it produces. For instance, the light coming from this light bulb is related to the temperature of this piece of metal. So there's a little bit of a clue as to what we're going to do with this in future segments. On the right, this compact fluorescent bulb here is another way to produce light artificially, but in this case, it is a gas that's inside of this tube that is being excited. And so the excitement of this gas will ultimately produce light. But what we will learn is the gas itself, when it becomes excited and produces light, will then put information into that light about the nature of the gas. So in other words, we can determine what is the chemical nature of this gas by the light that is being produced by the gas. So two very common things you'd find in your home when it comes to producing light in a dark room, but both of these demonstrate how the physics of light will tell us information about the objects that we're trying to study. Now, in the next segment, we're going to talk about how light travels from one place to another, the speed of light and the manner in which it travels. But we're out of time for this segment, so I hope you join me next time.